So welcome. Today I'm going to talk about performing under pressure. And while the main focus of what I'm going to talk about is directed towards situations where you will be dealing with an individual event, a particular day, time where you're going to have to perform your best, what I'm going to say and the techniques I'm going to outline are going to be equally applicable if you are working in a field where you have to continuously reach peak performance day after day in multiple situations. So all of the techniques, the processes and the frameworks I'm going to lay out today are going to be applicable whatever field of work you are in. So let's get to it. So let's just start by briefly looking at what the very opposite of performing at a high level under pressure is. And that's frequently described as choking. And that's where we see somebody who has got high level skills, the skills to perform whatever the immediate task is at a very high level, but we see those skills fall away significantly in the pressure situation. We see this very often in professional sport, and there's been a lot of studies done in basketball, professional basketball, particularly in relation to free throw success percentages in the final seconds of NBA games, and specifically where the outcome of the free throw is likely to be very significant in terms of whether the team wins or loses. And the statistics are really stark. There is a very significant fall away in the percentage success of free throws in those situations. So that's in a sporting context, but this equally applies in other situations. Now, statistics are harder to gather in other situations, but there's plenty of anecdotal examples. One really well-known one is Mahatma Gandhi earlier in his legal career. But still, a good level lawyer. I mean, Mahatma Gandhi, very articulate, very resilient individual. But he recalls running from court in panic as a result of essentially choking in a courtroom situation. So what we're seeing is a pattern. And what's happening in that situation is our system, our nervous system, our brain is effectively producing a threat response. And what happens in that situation is there is a release of cortisol and adrenaline. Now, that is not, as we will see, necessarily a bad thing. What we need to do is channel that response. But effectively, when that happens, we are at a crossroads. And we can go one of two ways. We can stay stuck in a fight, flight, or freeze response, and that almost always is going to lead to suboptimal performance. Or, as we'll see in a minute, we can use it as a gateway to higher levels of performance. So let's just talk about how we are going to access the higher levels of performance and take the path which puts us in that direction. So let's just talk firstly about how we prepare for the event. So the starting point is that we need to make sure that at a mental level, in terms of our mindset, we need to be framing those feelings of stress, fear that we may feel immediately before or even during an important performance, an important event. We need to actually frame those correctly, and we actually need to understand that they are a gateway to high levels of performance. It's important to say this because the traditional public health framing of stress is it's something to be resisted, something that we fight. Now, it's definitely true that chronic stress is something that needs to be addressed. And in fact, I would say not just from the long-term perspective of anyone's health that it's a real issue. If you are somebody who feels stress on a continuous basis, it will also impair your ability to perform under pressure, which is the subject of today's talk. So while that's true for long-term chronic stress, it is important that we reframe this in the context of those feelings of nerves, maybe a little bit of fear, when we're about to perform in a particular event. And there is a solid scientific basis for this. Two of the most well-known researchers into the field of flow performance, high performance states today are Stephen Kotler and Andrew Huberman. And the work they've done together has shown that in the opening seconds of entering a flow state, this high performance state, there is an autonomic arousal in our nervous system. And what that leads to is precisely these feelings of stress and fear. But what's also been demonstrated is that that is a necessary precursor to entering into these high performance states. So for a long time now, you will have heard, for example, about certain athletes training themselves to say, I'm excited rather than I'm worried, I'm feeling scared. And it turns out that that's not just an attempt to trick your mind. It actually turns out that based on this research, it's based on reality. That is something that's really important. We need to feel that sense of stress and fear to get to our high performance. So what I do with my clients is teach them a 3-step process at a conscious level, and I reinforce it at a subconscious level. And I'm going to just outline that 3-step process. And I'm going to start by acknowledging, in setting out this approach, the work of Dr. Alia Crum, who did some really important and really interesting research in this field, which led to this process. And she was the one who effectively first came up with this framework. So she conducted a study, and there was 2 groups. And the first group was shown a video which contained lots of descriptions of stress as something which was depleting. Again, coming back to that old public health framing of something to be resisted. And there was a second group who were shown a video where stress was described in a much more positive way, as something that could be enhancing. And the results of the research was really quite astonishing. It was found that the second group, the group who were shown the positive impacts of stress, it was framed in a positive way, had more positive affect, so emotions, feelings, high levels of attention, higher levels of cognitive flexibility, and even increased level of human growth hormone. So in fact, there was even a direct physical positive impact of being able to frame stress in the more positive way. Now, as a result of that, Dr. Crum really set out a different mental framework, because it was clear from that research that approaching stress in a more positive way would have positive outcomes. So what's the 3-step process? Well, the first is to accept when we feel that fear, stress, pressure in the moment. Just accept it, just acknowledge it's there. The second step is then to acknowledge it as our brain signaling that we face a challenge regarding something that's important to us. In other words, there's a goal there and we're being told there's a challenge. And that is a positive thing, because it's basically our brain saying to us, get ready. And the third step is to then say, what are the steps that you're going to take to move forwards towards this goal? So in other words, the whole framework is based around accepting and welcoming the fact that our brain is functioning just as it should. Feeling that pressure, feeling a little bit of fear, is actually our brain doing its job properly. Now, that's the conscious level of framing it. Now, the difficulty I know a lot of people will anticipate here is, well, that's fine, but in the moment my emotions can overwhelm me. I can say that to myself all I like, but in the moment I know my emotions can be so strong that they'll overwhelm me. And that's why my own personal approach is to then teach this to our subconscious. We always want our conscious and subconscious goals to align. And so I will actually follow up going through this at a conscious level by actually doing hypnotherapy to reinforce this approach at a subconscious level. And it therefore makes it so much easier in the moment to accept this idea that pressure is a privilege. So now let's move on to what I describe here as the training phase, which are really the long-term practices, things you might do not just in the immediate period of preparing for an event, but over weeks, months, even years. The starting point has to be to have the core skills around the task you are performing at a very high level. So to take the basketball example, which we used earlier, I can teach all of these techniques to calm the mind, but if the player has not, in the gym, worked repeatedly on the mechanical process of making that free throw as good as it can be, well, it's far more likely that their skill will come apart under pressure. They will perform poorly. So you have to do that. That's equally true if you're a knowledge professional. For example, when I was a courtroom lawyer, I had to continually work on updating my knowledge of the law, because I know that at some point a judge is going to challenge me in the kind of cases I had before the court on a point of law. And if I hadn't done that, I could have the calmest, most zen mind, but I would fall apart because I just didn't have the skill base, the knowledge base. So that's something to work on. And I can say there's definitely better ways and worse ways of maintaining and upgrading your skills. There's a huge body of work related to the science of flow and what's known as the struggle phase of flow, which is where we automate the skills which we need to perform in a flow state. And there's definitely better and worse ways of acquiring those skills. That will be the subject of a separate presentation, but for today's purposes, suffice to say that you need to make sure you have a constant program to update and upgrade your skills. The next thing to mention are what I describe here as broader life foundations. So I'm talking about really the pillars of health and high performance: sleep, exercise, nutrition. It is remarkable how often people who aspire to a high level of performance work extremely hard, but they see it as possible and necessary sometimes to compromise sleep, nutrition and exercise. They simply say, I haven't got enough time to sleep that many hours or to fit in some good quality exercise. But the reality is all of the science points in the same direction, that you really need to do these things consistently to give your best. So compromising sleep is a massive mistake, for example. Sleep is the most, the highest and best performance enhancing drug in the world. Don't compromise on it. So let's just assume for the moment that you have put those foundations in place. One really useful technique over a longer term is to practice raising your stress threshold. Now, there's various techniques I can talk about here, including things like Wim Hof breathing. My personal favourite is cold water exposure. And there's lots of evidence relating to this. And essentially, if you were to expose yourself to cold temperatures, so I'm thinking here specifically of an ice bath, but even if you can't access an ice bath, a cold shower is a good alternative. 12 minutes a week, between 1 to 5 minutes per day, is going to make a significant impact on your ability to be resilient to stress. There's also other benefits. You will get a release of dopamine in the aftermath. And what we're really looking for, if you did buy yourself one of those relatively cheap tubs and you could fill it with cold water, you want to be at a level which is uncomfortable, so that at the end of your period in it, you want to get out, but it's safe. And the absolute optimal is to allow yourself to sit in that cold water, ice water, up to below the level of your neck, effectively. And that will have a really significant impact. That will impact on your ability to cope with stress down the line. Another practice which I would recommend is gratitude. Now, there's a whole host of documented benefits to having a gratitude practice. But something which is particularly interesting in the context of high performance is there's been studies relatively recently showing that people who have a regular gratitude practice are more likely to be able to access these peak performance flow states. So, a couple of examples of how to incorporate a gratitude practice into your everyday life. One which is very well known is journaling. So you could simply either at the beginning or end of the day or both, just write one thing you're grateful for at that moment. And, sometimes people say I try and write 3 or 10. I think it's fine to write 1. Just start with that and think about it every day. And you will be rewiring your brain to be more positive and more resilient. An even better practice, in my view, I wouldn't suggest they're alternatives, but something I really like is something I call dynamic gratitude. And what I mean by this is, if you find that something difficult, challenging, bad, as you might frame it, happens in a day, try and immediately look for something positive. Ideally with that particular situation, or in general, immediately try and find something positive to say. So for example, imagine a colleague at work says something or does something which you find unpleasant or disagreeable in some other way, unhelpful. Try to immediately think about what positive qualities that person has, what they bring to your working environment, to your life. That again will help wire your brain in a more positive way, and it will enable you to access higher performance states, particularly when things go less well under pressure. Getting down to a more micro level, it's really important to plan and prepare for the specific things that can go wrong in the context of the performance you have to give. And it's important to be intentional about what you will do at a technical level, and also what you will bring in terms of the mindset as to how you respond. So again, I'm going to use an example from sport. Michael Phelps, famous, incredibly talented Olympic swimmer, used to regularly practice with broken goggles. And it turned out that was very useful, because in one of his finals, he actually had a situation where his goggles were not functioning properly. He couldn't see the end of the pool. But he'd been through this situation many times in training as a result of anticipating it, planning for it. And so he was technically aware how he should respond, and his mind was also ready. His mind was in the zone where it's, if this happens, I will be calm. I will follow this process. So think about that in the context in which you are operating. So I often find myself giving talks such as this, and sometimes, if I'm in a live situation, I have to be aware of the possibility that, for example, my slides may not work, the computer may fail. So a really good way to practice is, imagining, the computer comes off. I might even ask my assistant, as I go through a talk like this, to actually turn my computer off, maybe make some noise, and I will then see how I get on without that. So prepare for the worst. Another really good example of this at a team level, the English rugby team in 2003 played New Zealand in New Zealand, and historically the team had not performed well. Performing against the All Blacks in their own backyard is always a tough ask, but England had been very poor for a number of years when they'd gone to New Zealand. And there was a situation where they had 2 players sent to the sin bin, and they were defending a series of attacks on their own line. And as it happened, the coach at that time of the English rugby team, Clive Woodward, was somebody who was really leading the way in terms of preparation at an international level. He really was somebody who took professionalism to new heights. And they had very specifically prepared for this situation. And what was really striking about the situation was not just technically how they responded to having 2 players down, defending their own goal line under repeated pressure, but also the calmness. Nobody lost the discipline, nobody lost the cool. So they prepared at a technical level, and they prepared at a mindset level. And that enabled them to repel that series of attacks, win a penalty, clear their lines, and go on to win the game in a very unpromising situation. So think about whatever it is you're doing, and think about what challenges, what can go wrong. If there's other people you work with, ask them to sort of think of worst case scenarios and then prepare for them. Think about what you want to do technically and start to prepare yourself mentally. Again, I will use subconscious work through hypnotherapy to actually go through this mental preparation. That's particularly important for creating and reinforcing the mindset in these situations. But also we will reinforce the specific plan as to how to respond technically. So now let's move forward to the situation where you're just about to perform at the event. What I describe, using the sporting metaphor again, as the immediate pre-game situation. The essential point here is that you want to develop a pre-performance routine. Now, there is no single routine which is correct for everybody for all situations. But what I want to do is just outline some of the tools that you can use, and see this very much as a menu rather than a complete to-do list. You don't want to have to feel you have to use everything. That in itself can almost become a little bit exhausting and overwhelming. But just know that there are a series of techniques which are proven to help in this situation. The first one I'm going to mention, it's really two variants of the same thing, which is a kind of breath work, box breathing and tactical breathing. Both of these techniques are used by the US Navy SEALs, and as you can imagine, they face some highly pressurized situations. And it's been shown that these techniques work. It was particularly illustrated by success rates during particular phases of training. If I recall correctly, there was a particular exercise that had to be completed during training where recruits and potential people wanting to become Navy SEALs were thrown into a swimming pool with underwater diving gear, but with the oxygen tank disconnected. Unsurprisingly, the human brain really doesn't like that. It's a threatening situation, and a lot of people failed at that stage. And what was discovered was that once the box breathing technique was used before that training, the success rates really increased at a quite astonishing rate. So basically what's happening there is our nervous system is being calmed. We're able to focus, because that's one of the things that happens with box breathing and focusing on your breath. But we're also calming the whole autonomic nervous system. Just briefly, box breathing, it's essentially a 4-count breath in through the nose, then hold for 4, and then a 4-count breath out, and then hold again, and then repeat. Tactical breathing is essentially 4 count in, 8 count out. Even if those particular timings do not feel particularly easy for you, you can use something similar. So 4 in, 6 out, or 3-3-3-3 for the box breathing. For the tactical breathing, all I would say is make sure your out breath is a little bit longer than your in breath. That will definitely help calm your nervous system. Another technique is hypnotherapy, incorporating visualization. So this is something obviously Elliot and I do with our clients. And the visualization, I would just say it's really important that you anticipate the challenges. So actually use that to see how you will respond, again reinforcing the things that can go wrong and how you will respond. Neuro-linguistic programming anchoring is also a technique I use with clients. Effectively what we do is I will ask a client to remember a time where they were calm, confident and in control, and in any situation, and then I will ask them to choose a physical action in their body which they will then associate with it. The amygdala will recognize physical feelings in our body, and here we're deliberately creating a physical sensation and associating it with a good memory, a memory of being calm, confident and in control. And by doing that, you can then actually access those same feelings on the fly, just squeezing your fist. Eventually, if you practice this, you will eventually create automatically that association in your brain. So this also would be part of the longer term training plan that you would utilize, which I referred to in the previous slide. So any of those techniques are great things that you can use relatively easily before an event. So now let's have a look at what we're going to do when we're actually in the performance situation, when we're in game. The first thing we want to try and do, and as we will find out, flow states automatically drive us in this direction, is narrow our focus. There's really good evidence for this, and when I say narrow our focus, what we want to do is effectively look at the next step rather than being overly focused on the overall goal of what we're trying to achieve. There's been really great work done on this by Dr. Emily Balcetis, a psychologist from New York University, and she came up with something called the goal gradient hypothesis. And what that is an understanding that the closer we can bring a goal, the more likely we are to be able to achieve it. And what that then translates to is, if we've got a bigger goal, a larger goal, if we can actually focus on shorter intermediate targets, that is going to be very helpful. One of the things she worked on and studied was marathon runners, both professional and recreational, and she found that there was much higher performance levels when the runners focused on short intermediate targets, such as, I'm going to catch the person in front, I'm going to go to that, focus on that lamppost, than when they simply ran with the overall goal of completing the marathon or completing it as quickly as possible. And this work then translated into other fields, not simply athletic performance. So what we want to be trying to do in game, and again, this will come back to the training phase. We want to start thinking about how we will do this during the training phase. We want to be breaking down the tasks. We want to be breaking down what it is we have to achieve into smaller pieces. And part of the way we do this is asking good questions. And the central question in any moment we want to train is, what can I control? There's a well-known former US Navy SEAL trainer and commander, Rich Diviney, and he calls this process chunking certainty. And this is something they used to do in the field, and they still do. And this is the idea of saying, okay, what do I know about this situation? What's certain? What's not? And from there, what can I control and what's outside my control? And we immediately want to drive our focus onto the things we can control. So training those questions, preparing mentally in advance, visualizing, breaking down the challenge into various stages, and identifying the intermediate goals and how we will focus on intermediate goals is a really important way of maximizing our performance. And again, what I would say is that's work I would do with clients at a conscious level, but then we would reinforce that at the subconscious level to make sure that in the moment, the emotions did not overwhelm those conscious decisions about asking the good questions. As I mentioned a minute ago, what happens in flow states, we now know this from being able to access modern neuroscience imaging techniques and the many studies, is that flow actually automatically drives us in a direction whereby focus becomes narrow and also goes outwards. In other words, we don't focus on the self. What happens in a flow state is, it's called transient hypofrontality. And what that means is our prefrontal cortex, interestingly, a logical thinking part of our brain, is actually somewhat downgraded. But one of the benefits of that is we automate our decision making based on the skills we've acquired. But it also takes us away from ego-driven thinking in a sense of self. We just focus outwards on what it is we're after, what we're trying to achieve, what the next step is. So I do a lot of work. I've worked as a mentor on the Flow Genome Project, who have clients such as the US Navy SEALs and Google. And accessing flow states, creating frameworks to access flow states is really powerful, because it will enable you to more readily narrow your focus through accessing the flow states and be able to ask these questions calmly under pressure. So following on from what we've just discussed about asking good questions, a really great question to ask when we're in one of those difficult moments in a pressure situation is, what step can I take next to move in the right direction? Our brain feels calmer if we take control of the situation and ask and find an answer to that question. And what's really important to appreciate here is movement can be deciding to wait, slow down, or tactically retreat. An example from my legal career is, occasionally what would happen is, even with the best preparation, a witness would say something in court and you would know that it could take you in a direction which would be extremely difficult. And hopefully you would immediately recognize what that situation was, where the evidence could lead. And I would very often in that moment come up with a reason to briefly adjourn. I might ask the judge if it would be okay to have a comfort break, or I just need to clarify something with my solicitors. I'm effectively buying time there, because sometimes when you're in a difficulty, you cannot immediately move onto the counter-offensive. But by doing that, by buying time, and sometimes, as I say, it can be waiting and just slowing down, that's really important. Your brain will enjoy the feeling of just being calm, and just you are still moving forward in a broad sense, even if it's not in the most aggressive sense. So always try and think about what step you can take, and sometimes, very often in fact, in these difficult moments, it has to be a small step, and it can be seen as a somewhat defensive step, but that is still a good thing. So now I just want to give you a couple of additional techniques which you can use in the middle of an event, particularly if you're still feeling those nerves. One is another form of breath work, and it's called the physiological sigh. And what this is a breath in through your nose, a deep breath in through your nose, and then just about as you're completing that first breath in through your nose, just breathe in again, and then a long deep out breath. So something like this. And if you do as little as one and maybe up to 3 of those breaths, that will have a positive impact on your nervous system and calming you down. Now, sometimes even that won't be appropriate, even though it's a relatively short and easy technique, because, for example, if I was in a court case and the judge saw me doing that, might think I was a little odd. So a more traditional deep in breath through the nose and then a long out breath through the mouth. So something like 4 and 6 in terms of the timing will calm your nervous system. And if you can even do that once or twice, that will make a difference. I also mentioned earlier the neuro-linguistic programming anchor. And again, having trained that, this is a great technique, because you can just simply, for example, using the one I gave before, just squeeze your fist. Nobody's going to notice that. So if you're in a situation where you don't want somebody to see you're trying to cope with nerves, training that anchor in the way I described earlier is going to be really powerful, because if you do enough training on that and you get some good input as to how to do it, it will make a real difference, and it's something you can just access anytime you want. So, drawing some conclusions, all of the techniques I've shown you can be used basically whatever your field of work, and all of these things will enable you to access higher performance states over time. Although I've referred to sport a lot, it's essentially a metaphor for this talk. Some of my clients are professional athletes, but many more are knowledge professionals. And these techniques apply across the piece, because essentially our nervous system and our brain is working in the same way. I would really emphasize the importance of backing up these conscious approaches with subconscious approaches, because we do know that under pressure, our subconscious is very powerful and will often intervene in a way which is unhelpful if it's untrained. But if it's trained, then you can actually reinforce and solidify the approaches I've discussed at a conscious level. Just one final thought. Sometimes individuals have very specific historical reasons based on prior experiences why they have blockages in performance. And that's where the one-to-one work with a performance coach makes a real difference, because you need to effectively address that memory, which will be stored as a neural pathway in the brain, and you need to effectively rewrite the programming in that part of the brain. So there is real value in that type of work over and above the more generalized approaches which I've outlined today. So I hope you find a lot of value in today and apply it going forwards, and thank you for listening.